Okay, Parshas Bahaloscha. There's a lot in this week's Sedra. I want to focus on two particular parashas. The Parsha of Misoininim, which is the Parsha of the complainers, and then the psukim that follow that talk of Klal Yisroel complaining about the Mon, and then famously being able to receive the Slav. Let's try and understand what's going on there and the tremendous amount of wisdom and lessons that we can take ourselves for our lives living today. So, let's remember the events of the Psukim are taking place mere days after Har Sinai, after Matan Torah. Okay, so you can imagine the spiritual climb down almost. I would say hangover, but it's rather inappropriate. That after such an incredible, mind-blowing, once in a lifetime, once in a millennia event of Matan Torah of Har Sinai, and now we're a couple of days on, and Klal Yisroel are journeying away from Har Sinai, and the Pasuk tells us that literally within days, Vayihi ha'om k'misoininim, Rab ba'ozni Hashem. Now Klal Yisroel, the people, were complainers. But interestingly, the Pasuk doesn't detail what they were bothered by, what they were complaining about, but it does say that Hashem's reaction to their complaints was very, very sharp. Hashem's reaction was Vayichar apoi. Hashem became angry, as it were, and Hashem brought a swift punishment in the form of a fire. Hashem enabled the fire to come down and devour them, or some of them, and the fire began to spread. And it, as you can imagine, the fire begins to spread in a camp. It causes a lot of panic, and they started Vayitzakom, and Moshe, the Pasuk tells us, everyone cries to Moshe, Vayisparal Moshe, Moshe davens. So Moshe davens, the fire stops, and that's the end of this. That's the end of that. It's like we had a few psukim. The psukim detail Klal Yisroel were very bothered. They were complaining. Doesn't say what they were complaining about, but it does say that Hashem's reaction was very strong. That Hashem was very angry. Hashem brings the fire, devours them, and then Moshe davens, the fire stopped. What was their complaint? What was going on? And why did Hashem react with such a severe punishment of a fire? So the Ramban lays it out quite clearly that the Yidden moving away from Har Sinai, as we said a couple of days before, were now looking ahead and realizing that they're going to now go into a midbar, a journey through a midbar, which the Ramban calls Ha-midbar ha-godol va-ha-noira, a vast and awesome midbar. And I don't mean awesome in the positive sense of the word. You're talking an incredible amount of desolate land that they were going to have to trudge through. And the Ramban spells it out. Ma naseh, the Klal Yisroel said, what are we going to do in this great big midbar? Eich nichyeh b'midbar. How are we going to even live? How are we going to survive? Ma noicha, what are we going to eat? Ma nishta, what are we going to drink? Eich nizboil ha'omol v'ha'inoi umosai neitzah mimenu. How are we going to endure the difficulties that are going to come with traveling through a midbar? And when are we even going to leave the midbar? You can see all of these thoughts piling up, and everybody's consumed with anxiety and worry, and how are we going to get out of there? How are we going to survive? What's going to be? Right? And Ramban says that when they were speaking, when they were talking to each other, when they were pondering all these questions, they were speaking from a bitterness, from a hardship. A place like people who have pain. One can imagine someone going through a very difficult time and they're full of questions and wondering and worry and anxiety and how is it all going to work. This was what was consuming Klal Yisroel in a simple word of the Pasuk, Vayihi ha'om k'misoininim. They were moaning, they were complaining. Says Ramban, this is what was on their mind. And Hashem was angry. Why was Hashem angry? Says the Ramban, Shehoya lolem lo leches acharov. Besimcha, Uv'tov Levov, Meiroiv Kol Tova. Klal Yisroel should have been entirely different when they came at this point in their journey about to enter in the midbar. They should have gone faithfully after Hashem, Besimcha, with joy, Uv'tov Levov, with gladness of the heart. They were going to be happy and delighted to be with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Meiroiv Kol Tova. They ought to have spent a moment and realized the goodness that Hashem has provided them up until now and been happy and joyful over that. And that should have formed their attitude going forward. And instead, said the Ramban, they were like people being forced. You know, when you have a child, you're forced them to do something, and they moan and they groan every step of the way. That's what Klal Yisroel were like, being forced into this, not really wanting to be in there, completely with an attitude of complaining, of moaning, of pain. So because Klal Yisroel were ungrateful, and because Klal Yisroel allowed their worries, their natural worries and anxieties to get hold of them in this way, Hashem said, that's it. He brought a fire of destruction and killed off a bunch of Yidden. So first of all, this in itself, this very story, beginning, middle and end of this story, carries a very powerful limud, a very practical limud. And it's really to all of us in all of our lives, and it's essentially, don't be ungrateful for that which Hashem has given you. You might be living through, or you might be about to enter into a period of time where you have a lot of questions about, and you have a lot of reason to be concerned, to worry. I mean, there's never a real reason to worry, but you might, in your human mind, just think there is cause for concern. You know, you're wondering how things are going to work out. There's plenty in life, and we all have periods of time when we have uncertainties, we have vulnerabilities, we're not sure. What we can see from these psukim, just a few short psukim, is the right approach of a Yid is to focus on that which you can be grateful for to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and focus on that which is good in your life. Don't allow yourself the luxury of focusing on all those things that, as I say, you could have natural concerns about and natural worries. But the more you focus and the more you give that energy, the more you're going to be consumed by it. Don't let yourself go there. Go to the place of gratitude. And I'm not going to share them over here, but there's plenty of stories out there, and I'm happy to share afterwards if you want. But there's plenty of stories of people who've had literally miraculous experiences by taking this approach to the nth degree. And just comes to mind the story of a guy with a sick child, wherever it was. He went to a bracha and all this. It was very hopeless. And he decided his Kabbalah he was going to take upon himself was, instead of walking around, you know, with the weight of the world on his shoulders as he felt, he would instead turn it round, and he would turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he would thank Hashem for all the wonderful things that he did have, that was right in his life. And as you can imagine, there's a great happy ending, which doesn't always happen, of course, but the happy ending was that the miracle happened, and it was gewaldig, and it was great. And there's many, many stories like this, but my point isn't to storytell. My point is to say that you see from it the power and the two opposite extremes of Klal Yisroel, who were consumed with all that they were worried about, and what that caused was destruction, versus the right approach, as the Ramban says, which is to be besimcha v'tov leiv, and be grateful to Hashem for everything that He does do to us, that we can readily see as good, and focus on that, and don't let the other part come in. Okay, that's, I say, the practical takeaway from this particular thing. But there's something else going on here, which I want to share with you. The Medrash Tanchuma, Das Kainim, and other Mefarshim bring that among the people killed in this fire from Hashem were the 70 Zakenim. The Shivim Zakenim, the 70 Zakenim that have been around with us since the days of leaving Mitzrayim, these were the people among those who were killed. Why? So Medrash Tanchuma says quite a shocking thing. The Medrash tells us that when they were by Har Sinai, these Shivim Zakenim did not take it seriously enough, the Maimed Har Sinai, and they pretty much were too light-hearted about it all. They were having a bit of a chill. And the Medrash says, the Pasuk says, Vayechazu es Elikim, they saw Hashem, Vayoichlu vayishtu, and they ate and they drank. Talking about Har Sinai, best of my knowledge, there was no food on Har Sinai. So the Medrash says, there was no food there. So what does it mean they ate and they drank? Hikilu es roisham ka'oichlim v'shoisim. They were light-hearted as though they were feasting and eating and drinking and having a great chill. And this was such a terrible crime that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said these Shivim Zakenim would therefore have to die. It says a Medrash like Nadav Avihu had to die. When you don't accord the right level of respect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to Ruchnius, then unfortunately you can't be here anymore. But Hashem didn't want to kill them off right away. Imagine Maimed Har Sinai, you know, be a bit of a mess. It's all, everyone's so besimcha over the Kabbalah Satira, and then there's a whole bunch of people who die. It wouldn't have worked, it wouldn't have been nice. So Hashem waited. The Medrash tells Hashem waited, and this was the period that Hashem waited till. A couple of days later, Kaisel moaning, boom, Hashem brings a fire, and unfortunately part of that wiped away the Shivim Zakenim. Now, there's a number of things here. Firstly, a very quick note to those out there, and Baruch Hashem, I don't believe it's present company, but just those out there who think that one can just learn Torah Shabbat and be done with it. that you can draw everything you need to know just from the written word of the Torah Shabbat. Well, here's a brilliant example of how you can't do that. You read the Psukim, doesn't say very much at all. It says Klal Yisroel complained, and on face value, you see the Psukim, you don't see anything about Hashem's Zekanim. You don't see anything about pre-planned Hashem's cheshbonos of what, working things out so that certain people who deserve to die should die, etc. So you just see the importance and the value of always looking in Torah Baal Peh, of making sure to look in Chazal to get a true understanding of what's really going on. But more broadly, I think there's such a powerful lesson right here that we all see things happen in life, and unfortunately, as I said, in life stuff happens, tragedies happen, Rahman al-Islam, things happen that are difficult to witness, difficult to see, difficult to understand, and we think we almost deserve to understand, hey, why did this happen, or how terrible this is that it happened. And what you get to see from a parasha like this is there are layers upon layers upon layers, and all we might get to see is surface level understanding. We never get to see true and ultimate and authentic and pure cheshbonos shamayim, which is why HaKadosh Baruch Hu does what he does. You see this parasha, a couple of Eden complain, boom, they get wiped out with fire. What a tragedy. Yes, there is an element there that's tragic. But there's also people there that deserve to die. The minute you become aware of that, it changes, it colors the situation a little bit. It becomes, not so bad. I mean, it's still quite sad for them and all that, and maybe it would have been nice if they could do tshuva, etc. But the tragedy, the sort of the awesomeness of it, oh my gosh. So all it takes is the realization that there's layers upon layers upon layers behind everything that happens in life. And just because to your eye it looks tragic, or just because to your eye it seems, I'm not saying we should be inhumane, I'm not saying we shouldn't have empathy for people who are going through difficult times, of course. But in terms of perspective, in terms of realizing there's a bigger picture, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has layers upon layers of cheshbonos shamayim, and we just don't get to see that. What we do get to see is that everything is b'hashgachas Hashem. We have to live by that simple refrain. We have to live by that simple understanding and outlook of life. Everything happens for a reason. Everything is happening under the watchful eye and gaze and purpose driven by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that should satisfy our thirst to understand things. Fine, I think that's a very worthwhile perspective to draw from these psukim. But the psukim continue. So we've done the misoinim, we've done the complainers, we've drawn out the fact why they were complaining, we've said perhaps what was included in the fire that came as a punishment. But now the psukim, without a break of the parasha, without any peis or samachs, the psukim continue. And we begin with V'hasafsuf. And this is the parasha of the Yidden who complained. Initially it was the Eruv Rav, but then more from Klal Yisroel joined in. They complained about the mon. And the psukim say, his avu taiva. They began to desire a desire. What did they desire? So simply understood, they desired a bit of good flesh. They wanted some meat. Well, none of this artificial stuff with a mon. They want real food. That's what it looks like from the simple reading of the psukim. Number of questions. First of all, you complainers, did you see what just happened to Yidden who complained? Did you not notice that great big fire that raged and killed lots of people? What is going through their mind? How could they even dream of complaining now after seeing that? Second of all, why did they not want the mon? I mean, the mon was a miraculous food. But you know what? It could taste like whatever you wanted it to taste. It's the ideal food. It was miraculous food, straight from Hashem, with an option to taste kimat everything. So what were they missing? What was this desire that they were desiring? What was this thirst, this quench, this thing they couldn't get enough of? They really wanted more. What's wrong with mon? Well, why couldn't he be happy with mon? And the third question, which I think of all the questions of this is the most powerful. Do you know how Moshe Rabbeinu reacted when Klal Yisroel complained that they wanted meat and complaining about the mon? Moshe Rabbeinu reacted with a level of despair. The psukim detail, he turned to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he said, Lomar Yoslav Decha, why are you giving me such a difficult job of leading Klal Yisrael here? Loso mesmasa ha'omazeh alai, I have to carry the burden of the people on me. Lo yuchal lo nichi levadi, I can't do it by myself anymore. Losses come, I have to keep COVID in many, it's too heavy for me. This is the great quintessential Moshe Rabbeinu. This is the leader who's faced Paroi, who's gone through Makkahs, who took Klal Yisrael, obviously under HaKadosh Baruch Hu's command, out of Mitzrayim, who brought us to Matan Torah, who brought up the level of Klal Yisrael on 49th level of Tumah to Mitzrayim, to all the way till they're able to be Makabel Torah by Har Sinai. What a leader, what a teacher, and he's turning around now. that Klal Yisroel are moaning about the man, and he's saying that Hakadosh Baruch Hu, I can't anymore. This is just ridiculous. I can't do it on my own. What? What's happened here? What's being expressed here that pushed Moshe Rabbeinu to the brink in this way? So first of all, the Ramban says clearly, as we made the obvious point in our question, Klal Yisrael criticized Lo Lokhu Musa. They did not take any Musa from what had just transpired. They ought to have been a little bit reflective and a bit of realization, a bit of thinking. Something's gone on here. We've complained. The fire's come. We shouldn't really complain. We should kind of change our attitude. Lo Lokhu Musa. They didn't learn anything. So there's a criticism right there. Kleyoka even says that some didn't even realize that there was a punishment. That when the fire came down, some of them thought, oh, maybe some guy's tent caught fire. They didn't even see the Yad Hashem in it, which is how far removed they were from reflection. But that doesn't deal with the main point of what was really bothering them. So Rashi is always the one who brings the simplest pshat. But Rashi sometimes flavors things with a bit of medrash. But in this particular layer of psukim, Rashi brings three different chazal, three different sifris, which completely change the narrative. In Pasuk Dalet, Klal Yisrael said the words, Mi ya'achilenu basar. Who's going to give us meat? None of this mon thing. Who's going to give us meat? Says Rashi, they came out of Mitzrayim with plenty animals. If they really wanted meat, they had plenty to choose from. They could just shecht an animal and enjoy it. So what on earth are they doing? Complaining about who's going to give us meat? You've got meat in your backyard. Says Rashi, from a Sifri, they weren't really bothered about the meat. Elosh mevakshim alilo. They were just making trouble. They just wanted to stir it up a bit. They wanted to moan a little bit, wanted to complain a little bit. They weren't really after the meat. What a twist. Number one. Number two, they say, we remember the fish that we ate in Mitzrayim for free. As an aside, I always find this comment very amusing. It's called selective memory. You had the terrible Holocaust of Mitzrayim. You remember the bit of free fish, and you go, oh, didn't we have a good time? We had all that free fish. Come on, you really want to go back to Mitzrayim now? Putting that to the side, but Rashi questions the accuracy of it. Mitzrayim wasn't exactly a place that liked giving out freebies. They were taking away their teven, their straw. They didn't even give them the bricks free. And you think they gave them fish for free? What are they talking about? You know what Rashi says on the Sifri? What does it mean when they said the chinom? Chinom min ha-mitzvahs. Klal Yisrael were remembering a time where we didn't have any mitzvahs to keep. So they say their problem is the fish. Nothing to do with the fish. They were remembering a time where they didn't have to keep mitzvahs. And then the third one, Vayishma Moshe, Moshe and Rabbeinu hears all this going on, and he hears them crying with their families. So Rashi first of all says, well, there's a whole hysteria. They got together with their families. They made one big fat cry because when the families get together in panic, it's all everyone adds to each other's panic, and it gets very, very big commotion. Fine, that's the pashtus. But for Rabbi Seinu Omru, why they were crying? Al iske mishpachos, al arayas han eseres lahem. Klal Yisrael were crying because of the arayas, because with Matan Torah, a whole new code of conduct became passed down, and relationships that they had been in had now become osa, and they were upset that they had to now pull away from people who they might have been with for a while, who were arayas. So that's why they were crying. Hang on a second. So the Psukim tell us that Klal Yisrael were bothered because they didn't like the mon. But actually, when you peel it back a little bit, it's not really the mon that's the problem. Because the bossar, nunu, they had their bossar, you're right. So they were just causing problems. They just had a bit of moaning to do. The fish, it wasn't the fish. They were desiring the mitzvahs-free zone that was Mitzrayim. And finally, why they were crying? They were crying because they would like to do a bit of rice, which they're not able to do anymore. There's a wise lesson here, by the way, for people who have those who complain in their life, or those who, it could be spouses, children, friends, whoever it might be. Often, when people talk about something, they're not actually saying the words that they really mean. So they'll say something, but you have to kind of dig a little bit deeper to understand what they really bothered by. Yeah, you remember the fish. Come on, what's really going on? Oh, I remember not being with mitzvahs. Okay. What's going on here? How can we, what's happened to Klal Yisrael? What has happened to Klal Yisrael? They've just come off the back of Matan Torah. They've just come off the back of 7 weeks of aliyah after aliyah after aliyah. What a glorious period of time it's been. And now what? They're busy with fish, not wanting mitzvahs. Arayas are bothering them. You literally days ago said Na'aseh v'nishma. You said it so uniquely that the Malachim said about Klal Yisroel, Mi gilo rozeh, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Mi gilo rozeh lemaleh. Who told them this gewaldige secret of putting in so much commitment? Unbelievable. Ma'amad Har Sinai. And now you're busy reversing everything? I want to suggest, by the way, that after we've now kind of revealed what was really going on with their frustrations with Ammon, that I think this is what Moshe Rabbeinu was exasperated by. When Moshe Rabbeinu heard their cry of, we want the free fish in Mitzrayim, he knew they weren't after the fish, and he knew that the problem wasn't Ammon. He understood, like the Sifri taught us, he understood what was really going on for them. And Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, I can't anymore. I brought them so far, and now they're still upset about the commitments that they've made, the mitzvahs. They still can't tear themselves away by our eyes. They're still holding with all this moaning and groaning, showing, look, I can't anymore. Moshe Rabbeinu was almost at his wit's end. But how do we understand what happened to Klal Yisroel? What happened to their... So the Orach Chaim says, on the posuk of Yud Aleph Yud, where Rebbe Shalom responds to this level of complaining, Hashem says, Vayicha af Hashem ma'od. Hashem was very angry. And the Orach Chaim says this word ma'od is very indicative. Sometimes people fall by Avera. People do Averas. But you know what? The Yetzer Hara works really hard. The Gemara tells us the Yetzer Hara doesn't let a day go by without pushing us to do an Avera also. So, a guy ends up doing an Avera because he's tempted by the Yetzer Hara. Says Orach Chaim, you know what? Yesh lodun boy tzad oinus. You could look at that and say, look, there's a little bit of forcing going on here. There's a little bit of an oinus here. We can't hold him totally 100% responsible. Now, of course, we've got our own free will, and of course, we have to do tshuva. I get all that. But it takes the edge off it. It's like, the Yetzer Hara, at the end of the day, is working very hard to push us, and Hashem knows that. But the worst thing about these Yidden here, says Orach Chaim, was there was no Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara wasn't tempting them in any way in this particular situation. Hareheim kimagrim bahem Yetzer Hara. They were like winding up the Yetzer Hara. They were like bringing in the Yetzer Hara. They were like feeding frenzy of, oh, do you remember Mitzrayim? Yeah, without any mitzvahs. And Bechel Mishvachosov. Oh my gosh, how terrible, how tragic. Oh. They were like winding themselves up almost without any help of the Yetzer Hara. That's what got Hashem angry. Hashem's like, the Yetzer Hara's not even pushing you and you're still upset about all this Yiddish guy? That was the criticism. But what I would still like to understand a little bit more is, how did Klal Yisroel end up here? So, there is 3 parokim in Mesilas Yesharim, from Yud Gimel to Tes Vav, where he talks about the midah of precious. Now, in Yiddishkeit, we do not advocate what the non-Jewish like to advocate, which is a spiritual person should be completely removed from this world. We don't believe in that. Having said that, we do believe in living a balanced life where a person is not sucked into this world. There's a difference. A person can work and see his work for earning money as being a means of serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu and using Olam Hazeh in order to serve Hashem. That's a different perspective versus the other guy who just wants the fancy car, just wants a big house. He keeps on going after pleasures of this world to the sake of pleasures of this world. Right? The difference, I think, is obvious to everybody. Says the Mesilas Yesharim, though, a person who lives with such, being so sucked in and so succumbed to what's going on available in Olam Hazeh without having that perspective of serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu overall, the problem is, says the Mesilas Yesharim, they're feeding the Yetzer Hara. And one thing leads to another, the Yetzer Hara grabs hold of them. And the example I gave of the 2 people, one who's working in Shem Shemayim, one who's not, comes relevant when there's kind of things at stake. So the guy who's working in Shem Shemayim won't steal, and he won't lie, and he won't miss Tefillah B'tzibur if he can help it, because he's got Parnasa duties. Whereas the other guy who's just doing whatever he can to make the next buck, he won't mind, a bit of rounding the edges. The Mesilas Yesharim's lashon is kizoysi tachbula gedola la'adam lemani notzam Yitzray. The tachbula, the best way, the best method that a person can engage in order to be saved from this grasp of the Yetzer Hara, is his poidus. A person needs to put into their life a moment of quiet reflection. If a person comes at life 90 miles an hour and allows life and the events of life to bamboozle them and take them over and let themselves be consumed with the next worry and the next thing that's going on in their life and what's going to be with this and they allow themselves to go down that road, then they're doomed, because they're going to be in this loop of the Yetzer Hara's grasp. The best way to avoid that, and to avoid, therefore, being too entrapped with Olam Hazeh and with the Yetzer Hara more broadly, is to have his spoilers, have the moments of quiet reflection, being able to just take a step back and just become present. Just take it on. Don't just rush forward with the next project, however spiritual, however wonderful it is. Klal Yisroel's problem, you know what their problem was? The problem was they complained. They allowed themselves to become consumed by all the worries, as the Ramban points out, man noicha, man nisha, that was before. But now as well, the problem is, it's going to be alright, don't we remember Mitzrayim, how great it was, the mitzvahs-free zone, the selected memory, remember, yeah? Mitzrayim, great place, mitzvahs-free zone. They allowed themselves to become too quickly consumed with all these thoughts and all these worries and all these considerations without taking the time, as the Ramban said, they did not take the time to just stop and just consider and just get some perspective on life and realize, what are we actually here for? Don't just rumble-dumble into the next worry, into the next concern. And briefly, just to finish this point, how wonderful this is, because when Hashem responds to Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu says, I can't anymore, I can't do this by myself, Hashem says, appoint a new load of 70 Zekanim, right? Because they were just all nifta in the fire. Appoint a new load. Who should be these 70 Zekanim? Who should be these 70 Zekanim? You know who to take them from? Says Rabbeinu Shloim, in Mitzrayim, there were Jewish taskmasters. There were people who Mitzrayim appointed to make sure that they kept the rest of Klal Yisroel in order, to make sure that they did the hard work that was required. And you know what? These taskmasters were tzaddikim. They were not prepared to hurt other Yidden for the sake of Mitzrayim, so they didn't enforce the Mitzrayim's word. As a result, they themselves were beaten and were brutalized by the Mitzrayim. These taskmasters, says the Rebbeinu Shloim, take them on board. And the Medrash, a beautiful lashon, that if a person gives themselves over to Klal Yisroel in this way, they will be zeicher to Gdula, and this is exactly what happened to the Shivim Zekanim. But in my view, there's a hidden message that lies in here as well. That this appointment of the Shivim Zekanim was a message to Klal Yisroel. You, Klal Yisroel, you're becoming consumed with every difficult thing in your life. First it's this, then it's that, it's going to be the midbar, it's going to be the arayos and the chinam and the mitzvahs and all the rest of it. You're just letting yourself become so taken over and so bothered by every single difficulty and every single problem. Look at these Shivim Zekanim. Look what they had to face in Mitzrayim. Look how they dealt with difficulty and tragedy. They turned around, they manned up, and they faced their situation with resilience and with courage. And look where that got them. It pulled them through and they became Oile L'Gdula. The Rebbeinu Shloim is delivering a message to Klal Yisroel and saying, guys, you got to realize that Yiddishkeit is a gewaldige Sache. You're going to keep it every day of your life, whether it's easy, whether it's hard. You got to be prepared to dig deep and find that energy, find that resilience, and find that courage to be able to ride through the difficulties. Have the perspective that you need to have. And of course, be grateful to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the hatovas that Hashem does give us. And that way you can be more successful. Go ahead, Charles.